The stench of unwashed bodies and despair was the first thing that greeted her. Anya stood on the auction block, a coarse burlap sack tied around her wrists. The wood was rough beneath her bare feet, splintered and stained with the tears of 100 others who had stood here before her. She kept her eyes downcast, a curtain of straight dark hair hiding her face from the leering crowd. It was better this way. To see their faces was to see her own worthlessness reflected back at her. Broken, defective, mute. Her father, Lord Gavril, had used those words himself when he'd sold her to the flesh traders for a pittance. A daughter who could not speak was a daughter who could not forge a powerful alliance through marriage. She was a useless ornament, and he had finally tired of dusting her off. "Do not cry," she told herself, the command a silent echo in the vast emptiness of her mind. Tears are a sound you cannot afford. She had not uttered a word, not a single sound, in 10 years. Not since her mother's deathbed, where she had made a solemn vow, a vow of silence, offered to the old gods in exchange for her mother's peaceful passage to the spirit realm. The gods had accepted her sacrifice, and the silence had become her prison, her shield, and her only companion. Anya flinched as the auctioneer, a man with a belly that strained the buttons of his vest, grabbed her arm. He shoved her forward, turning her for the crowd. His voice was a grating boom that scraped against her soul. "And here we have a rare one," he bellowed, his breath smelling of stale wine. "From noble blood, though you wouldn't know it to look at her now." Lord Gavril's silent daughter. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Pity from some, scorn from most. A silent noblewoman was a curiosity, but ultimately a flawed product. What good was a wife who could not flatter, a servant who could not answer, a companion who could not converse? Her father's face swam in her memory, his cold, dismissive eyes, the finality in his voice as he told her she was a burden he would no longer bear. The memory was a fresh wound, bleeding into the terror of the present moment. She had been his daughter. Now she was chattel. "She is trained in the womanly arts," the auctioneer continued, his grip tightening on her arm. "She can sew a fine seam, read and write, and her silence ensures she will never speak out of turn." He punctuated the statement with a harsh laugh, and a few men in the crowd joined in. The sound was like stones thrown against glass. Anya's inner wolf, the part of her soul that was pure instinct, whimpered and flattened itself against the floor of her being. It was a spirit cowed by years of neglect and emotional starvation. The bidding began, low and insulting. A farmer offered a few copper pieces, likely for field labor. A brothel madam inspected her with a critical eye, then shook her head and turned away. "Not pretty enough," her expression seemed to say. "Too thin, too haunted." Anya felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were floating above her own body, watching this humiliation unfold upon a stranger. This was her life now. A series of hands passing her from one owner to the next until she was used up and discarded. Hope was a luxury she had given up long ago, along with her voice. Then, the atmosphere in the market square shifted. A hush fell over the crowd, a sudden fearful silence that was more profound than her own. The jeers and bids died on people's lips. Even the auctioneer faltered, his booming voice shrinking to a nervous squeak. Through the parting crowd he walked, King Rorik, the Shadow King of the North. Anya had only heard stories, terrifying whispers told in hushed tones around late-night fires. They said he was more beast than man, that his heart was a shard of ice, and his kingdom, the Shadow Keep, was a fortress of eternal winter and silence. They said he commanded legions of brutal, faceless warriors, and that he had taken his throne by spilling the blood of his own kin. He was a nightmare given form, and he was walking directly toward the auction block. He was taller than any man she had ever seen, broad-shouldered and clad in black leather and dark fur that seemed to drink the very light from the air. His hair was the color of a moonless night, long and untamed, and his face was a mask of cold, hard lines. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from her lungs. They were the color of a stormy sky, gray and turbulent, and they burned with a chilling intensity. He moved with the predatory grace of a wolf, his presence a physical weight that pressed down on everyone in the square. His personal guard, the feared shadow guard, followed in his wake, their faces hidden behind black steel helms. They did not walk. They flowed like wraiths, their armor making no sound. The Shadow King's domain was one of absolute silence. It was said that no music played in his halls, no laughter echoed, no unnecessary word was ever spoken. To make a loud noise in his presence was to invite a swift and brutal death. Her own curse suddenly seemed like a strange, twisted form of reverence for his rule. King Rorik stopped at the foot of the auction block. He did not look at the auctioneer or the crowd. His stormy gray eyes fixed on her, and only her. It was not a man's gaze. It was the gaze of a predator assessing its prey. Anya felt stripped bare, every fear, every scar on her soul laid open for his inspection. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the suffocating silence. The instinct to run, to hide, was overwhelming, but she was chained to this block, a helpless offering before a dark god. He will not buy me, she thought, a frantic prayer. What would a king want with a broken thing like me? But his gaze held her, unwavering. It was as if he could see past the dirt and the fear, past the silence, and into the very core of her being. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, her inner wolf lifted its head, a flicker of recognition in its spiritual eyes, a sense of a deep, primal connection that made no logical sense. It was an instinct she immediately crushed. It was madness. The auctioneer, sweating profusely, finally found his voice, though it was a mere shadow of its former boom. Your Majesty, an unexpected honor. This is merely a trifle, not worthy of your notice. King Rorik did not acknowledge him. His eyes remained locked on Anya's. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them, the noise of the market fading into a distant hum. She could feel the raw power rolling off him in waves, a palpable force that was both terrifying and strangely magnetic. He was a man drowning in his own darkness. She could see it in the tightness of his jaw, the profound loneliness in those storm-gray eyes. It was a desolation she recognized, for it mirrored her own. Then he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the air like a blade of obsidian, deep and rough, like stones grinding together in the heart of a mountain. I will take her. The words were a command, not an offer. The auctioneer gaped, his jaw working silently. The crowd stared, a sea of stunned faces. No one dared to move, to breathe. 1,000 gold crowns, the king stated, the price so exorbitant, so utterly ludicrous for a mute girl, that a collective gasp finally broke the spell of silence. It was a sum that could buy a small army, a fortune that could secure a noble house for a generation. He had offered it for her, for nothing. Anya's mind reeled. This was not happening. It was a fever dream, a cruel trick of a desperate mind. Why? Why would he do this? Was this some new form of punishment? A game for a bored, cruel king? One of the king's shadow guards stepped forward and tossed a heavy purse onto the stage. It landed with a deafening thud, the sound of finality, the sound of her life being sold. The auctioneer, fumbling and pale, rushed to untie her bonds. His hands trembled so badly he could barely work the knots. As soon as her wrists were free, another guard ascended the steps. He was built like a stone wall, his featureless helmet betraying no emotion. He reached for her arm. Anya recoiled, a lifetime of helplessness culminating in a single, instinctual movement of self-preservation. But the king's voice stopped his guard. "Brennus, I will." The guard, Brennus, bowed his head and stepped back. King Rorik himself mounted the steps of the auction block. He moved with an unnerving stillness, his presence filling the small space, eclipsing the sun. He stood before her, a mountain of shadow and power. Anya had to crane her neck to look up at him, and still, she could not meet his eyes. She stared at the hard line of his jaw, the pulse beating steadily in his throat. He reached out, his hand large and calloused, scarred from a life of battle. She flinched, expecting a blow, a rough grip. Instead, his touch was surprisingly gentle. His fingers brushed against her cheek, his thumb sweeping away a smudge of dirt. The contact was like a bolt of lightning, a shock of warmth against her cold skin. It was the first gentle touch she had known in a decade. Her breath hitched, and against her will, her eyes lifted to meet his. Up close, the storm in his eyes was even more intense, but beneath the cold fury, she saw something else. A flicker of, what? Recognition? Possession? Yearning? His inner wolf was looking at her, and hers, to her horror, was looking back. Mate. A voice whispered in the deepest part of her soul. It was a word she had read in old texts, a concept from a forgotten time. A bond of souls, a fated connection that defied logic and reason. It was impossible. It was a fairy tale, and it was happening to her. Terror, sharp and cold, pierced through her shock. To be mated to this man, this feared and brutal king, was not a blessing. It was a death sentence. Her vow of silence stood between them like a wall of unbreakable glass. A mate was a partner, a confidant. How could she be a mate to anyone when her most essential form of connection was forbidden to her? He would see her as defective, just as her father had. He would expect her to speak, to answer him, to be his queen in voice as well as body. When she could not, his kindness, if it even was kindness, would curdle into contempt. He would break her. He lowered his hand and gestured for her to walk ahead of him. It was a silent command, one she had no choice but to obey. As she stepped down from the auction block, leaving her old life behind in the dust, she felt his gaze on her back, a physical weight. She was no longer Anya of House Gavril. She was the property of the Shadow King, and she was walking into the heart of his darkness. The journey to the Shadow Keep was a silent, grueling affair. They traveled on black horses that moved with the same unnatural quiet as their riders. Anya was placed on a steed of her own, a gentle mare that seemed to sense her fear. King Rorik rode at the head of the column, a formidable silhouette against the bleak northern landscape. He never looked back, yet she felt his awareness of her like a constant pressure. They rode for days, the terrain growing harsher, the air colder. The lush green of the southern lands bled away into gray rock and skeletal trees. The sun itself seemed weaker here, a pale disk in a perpetually overcast sky. It was a land that had forgotten warmth. Anya wrapped her thin cloak tighter, the fine wool a gift from the king's pack, one of the few acts of acknowledgement she'd received. The guards ignored her. They were extensions of their king's will, silent and severe. They treated her not with cruelty, but with a complete lack of interest, as if she were a piece of luggage to be transported. In the cold, She found a strange clarity. The shock of the auction had worn off, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. What awaited her at this shadow keep? What did this terrifying man want from her? The price he had paid still echoed in her mind. It was the price of a queen, not a concubine or a servant. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She could not be his queen. She could not be anything to him. Her vow was absolute. To break it was to condemn her mother's spirit to wander, lost, for eternity. It was a price she would never, ever pay. Finally, they saw it. The shadow keep rose from the mountainside like a fang of black rock, piercing the gray sky. It was not a castle. It was a wound in the earth, a fortress of jagged towers and sheer walls that seemed to have been carved by claws rather than by hands. No banners flew from its ramparts. No light shone from its arrow-slit windows. It was a monument to silence and sorrow. As they passed through the immense iron-bound gates, a chill deeper than the mountain air settled into Anya's bones. The courtyard was empty, paved with dark, unforgiving stone. The only sound was the wind, whistling a mournful tune through the battlements. Inside, the keep was a labyrinth of cold stone and deep shadows. Torches burned in iron sconces, but their light seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness rather than pushing it back. The air was still and heavy, thick with the scent of cold stone, wood smoke, and something else. Something wild and musky, the scent of a predator, the scent of the king. Servants moved through the halls like ghosts, their heads bowed, their feet silent on the stone floors. They all wore drab gray tunics, their faces blank and expressionless. No one spoke. The silence here was not peaceful. It was a living thing, a rule enforced by fear. Anya felt as if she were stepping into a tomb. She was led to a suite of rooms high in one of the towers. They were surprisingly opulent, a stark contrast to the rest of the keep. A large bed with furs piled high, a crackling fire in a stone hearth, and a window that looked out over the desolate, beautiful mountain range. It was a gilded cage. A stern-faced woman with hair the color of iron filings entered the room. She introduced herself with a clipped nod. "I am Morwenna, the king's cousin and steward of this keep. You will be bathed and clothed." Her eyes, small and black, raked over Anya with unconcealed disdain. This was the woman who ruled the king's home in his stead, and she clearly saw Anya as an unwelcome intrusion. There was a possessiveness in her gaze when she mentioned the king, a viper's warning coiled in her posture. Anya recognized an immediate enemy. Two young servant girls followed Morwenna into the room. They were pale and trembling, their eyes darting nervously as they helped Anya out of her filthy clothes and into a steaming bath. The hot water was a luxury, but she could not relax. Morwenna stood by the fire, watching her every move, her presence a suffocating weight. "Why am I here?" Anya screamed in her mind. "What does he want?" After the bath, they dressed her in a simple but elegant gown of dark blue wool. It was warm and soft against her skin. They brushed her long, dark hair until it shone in the firelight. When they were finished, she looked in the polished silver mirror and saw a stranger. The haunted, grimy girl from the auction block was gone, replaced by a pale, wide-eyed noblewoman who looked utterly out of place in this fortress of shadows. Morwenna's lips thinned into a bloodless line. "The king will dine with you. Here, do not displease him." The threat was unspoken but perfectly clear. She swept from the room, leaving Anya alone with her racing heart. He was coming. She paced the room, the wool of her dress whispering against the stone floor. The fire crackled, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent tower. She went to the window, staring out at the jagged peaks. She was a prisoner here, no matter how comfortable the cell. When the door opened, she spun around, her body tensing. King Rorik filled the doorway. He had shed his heavy furs and leathers, now dressed in a simple black tunic and trousers that did nothing to hide the raw power of his physique. The firelight played over the harsh planes of his face, making the shadows deeper, his expression unreadable. His storm-gray eyes found hers across the room. The intensity of his gaze was a physical blow. The primal recognition hummed between them again, a low, dangerous thrum beneath the surface of the silence. Her inner wolf paced, restless and agitated. It knew him, it yearned for him, and it terrified her. He entered the room and the space seemed to shrink. He moved with that same silent, predatory grace, circling the room as a wolf might circle a nervous deer. He did not speak, merely observed. He looked at the fire, the bed, the window, and then his eyes came back to rest on her. Two servants entered carrying a tray laden with food, roast meat, dark bread, cheese, and a flagon of deep red wine. They set it on a small table near the fire, their movements swift and silent, their eyes never leaving the floor. They bowed low and scurried out, closing the door softly behind them, leaving her alone with him. He gestured to the table, a clear invitation to eat. Her stomach was a knot of anxiety, but she obeyed, sitting in one of the heavy wooden chairs. He took the seat opposite her. The fire crackled between them. He served her himself, placing a piece of meat and bread on her plate before serving his own. The gesture was so unexpectedly normal, so domestic, that it threw her off balance. She had expected a beast, a tyrant. This quiet, watchful man was somehow more unnerving. They ate in complete silence. Anya could not taste the food. Every nerve in her body was focused on the man across from her. She watched his hands as he cut his meat. They were large, scarred, and capable of immense violence, yet his movements were precise and controlled. She felt his eyes on her, studying her every move, her every flinch. "Say something," a part of her brain screamed. "Ask him why you are here." But her lips were sealed, the vow a physical lock on her throat. When the meal was over, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. He still had not spoken a single word to her since the auction. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. It was a test. She knew it was. He was waiting for her to speak. He was waiting for something she could never give him. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice the same low rumble she remembered. "They call you the Silent Daughter." It was a statement, not a question. Anya could only nod, her heart pounding. "Why?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. This was it, the question that would define her existence here. She could not answer. She looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. The shame and frustration burned in her chest. How could she explain a sacred vow to this godless king? He would think it a weakness, a foolishness. She shook her head, a small, helpless gesture, a plea for him to understand what she could not say. A flicker of something, disappointment, anger, crossed his face before his mask of cold indifference slammed back into place. He stood up, the movement sudden and sharp, making her jump. "You are safe here," he said, his voice flat. "No one will harm you. You will want for nothing." He turned and walked to the door. His words were a promise of protection, but they felt like the bars of her cage closing shut. He was providing for her, as one would a prized pet. At the door, he paused, his hand on the iron latch. He looked back at her over his shoulder, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "But you will learn that in my kingdom, silence is a courtesy, not a shield. I expect you to speak to your king." And then he was gone, the heavy door closing with a soft click that echoed in the silent room like a death knell. Anya sank back into her chair, a choked sob caught in her throat. A sob she could not release. He did not understand. He thought she was merely willful, defiant. He had bought her, and he expected her to perform, to speak. The first crack in his unexpected kindness had appeared. She had displeased him, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she would displease him again and again until his patience finally shattered. And she did not want to imagine what would happen then. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Anya lived in her gilded cage, a ghost haunting the Shadow King's tower. Servants brought her meals, fresh gowns, and books from a vast, dust-choked library. They never spoke to her, and their eyes were always downcast, full of a quiet fear that seemed to permeate the very stones of the keep. She spent her hours reading ancient histories and forgotten tales. The stories were her only escape, a place where heroines had voices to sway kings and change their fates. Her own fate felt as immutable as the mountains outside her window. King Rorik visited her every evening. He would arrive as the sun bled away behind the peaks, bringing with him the chill of the night and an aura of absolute authority. They would share their meal in the same thick, unnerving silence. He would watch her, his stormy eyes trying to peel back her layers to find the words she kept locked away. And every night, he would ask her a question. Did the food please you? Did you find a book to your liking? Are your rooms comfortable? They were simple questions, but they were traps. Each one was a demand for the one thing she could not give. In response, she could only nod or shake her head, her frustration a bitter taste in her mouth. She would write her answers on a small slate she'd been given, but it was a poor substitute. Writing was slow, impersonal. It was not the connection he was seeking. Each silent refusal, each shake of her head when he gestured for her to speak, chipped away at his formidable control. A muscle in his jaw would tighten. The storm in his eyes would darken. He would leave her chamber with a curt nod, his disappointment a cold wave that washed over her long after he was gone. She learned more about him from the whispers she was not meant to hear. The servant girls who tidied her room would sometimes forget she was there, a silent fixture by the window. They spoke of the curse, a shadow curse they called it, placed on his bloodline generations ago. It fed on sound, on emotion, on life. It was why the keep was so silent, why the king was so cold and withdrawn. The curse twisted joy into pain, laughter into agony. It was a constant parasitic presence, slowly draining the life from him and his land. The knowledge settled in her heart like a stone. His enforced silence wasn't just cruelty or preference, it was a defense. A desperate measure to starve the beast that lived inside him. And here she was, the silent girl, a perfect companion for a cursed king. The irony was so cruel it would have been laughable if she'd had the ability to laugh. Her pity for him grew, a dangerous, tender vine winding its way around her fear. She saw the exhaustion etched beneath his eyes, the profound loneliness he tried to hide behind a mask of command. Her inner wolf, the soul-deep instinct she fought to suppress, recognized his pain. It saw his wolf, chained and starved by the curse, and it yearned to offer comfort. One evening, he arrived looking more weary than she had ever seen him. There were new lines of strain around his mouth, and the shadows under his eyes were darker, deeper. He barely touched his food, his gaze fixed on the crackling flames in the hearth. Tonight, he did not ask her a question. He simply sat there, shrouded in a bleak silence that felt heavier than usual. Acting on an impulse she did not understand, Anya stood and went to a side table where the wine flagon rested. She poured a goblet of the deep red liquid, her hands steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. She walked over to him, her soft slippers making no sound on the stone. He looked up as she approached, his eyes guarded, surprised. She held the goblet out to him, a simple offering, a silent gesture of what? Care? Sympathy? He stared at the goblet, then at her face. His gaze was searching, intense. For a long moment he did not move. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it from her. His fingers brushed against hers and the familiar jolt of energy, of recognition, shot up her arm. It was stronger this time, a current of warmth in the cold room. His eyes held hers as he drank. When he lowered the goblet, he did not immediately release her gaze. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. The two words were an intimacy that stole her breath. He had accepted her silent offering. He had understood the intent behind it. A tiny seed of hope, fragile and foolish, began to sprout in the barren wasteland of her heart. But hope was a dangerous thing in the Shadow Keep. Her elevated status had not gone unnoticed. Morwenna's animosity grew with each passing day. The king's cousin would find reasons to visit Anya's tower, her black eyes missing nothing, her words dripping with veiled venom. "The king shows you great favor," she said one afternoon, watching Anya arrange some wildflowers a servant had brought. "A strange choice. A broken toy for a broken man." Anya did not react, her face a carefully blank mask. But the words struck their target, reminding her of her father, of her own perceived worthlessness. "He tires of new things quickly," Morwenna continued, her voice a silken threat. "When your novelty wears off, he will cast you aside, and you will have no one, a silent little mouse in a castle of wolves." The threat was clear. Morwenna saw her as a rival for the king's attention, for power within the keep, and she would not hesitate to destroy her. The tension in the castle was a constant humming wire, but in the evenings, in the quiet solitude of her tower with Rorik, Anya felt a strange sense of peace. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer a void of unanswered questions, but a shared space, a language of its own. She would read by the fire while he worked on maps and dispatches at the table. She would watch the firelight dance on his dark hair, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. He, in turn, would watch her, a look of quiet contemplation on his face. One night, a fierce blizzard descended upon the keep, rattling the shutters and howling like a hungry beast. The storm seemed to energize the curse within the castle's walls. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, writhing as if they were alive. A palpable malevolence filled the air. Rorik stood by the window, staring out into the swirling snow. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his entire body rigid with tension. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound of pure agony. Anya's heart clenched in fear and sympathy. The curse was hurting him. Without thinking, she went to him. She didn't know what she could do, what she could offer. She was powerless. But she could not simply sit and watch him suffer. She reached out and laid a hesitant hand on his arm. His muscles were like steel beneath his tunic. He flinched at her touch, a sharp, violent movement, and spun to face her. His eyes were wild, the gray irises almost completely swallowed by the black of his pupils. This was not the controlled king she knew. This was the beast, fighting its chains. "Go," he snarled, his voice a guttural rasp. "Get away from me." But she didn't. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the plea for help warring with the command to flee. Her own fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her compassion was stronger. She held her ground. Instead of pulling her hand away, she slid it down his arm, her fingers lacing through his. His hand was freezing cold. She held on, pouring all of her silent strength, her silent comfort, into that simple touch. He stared down at their joined hands as if he had never seen such a thing before. The tension in his body seemed to lessen, the wildness in his eyes receding. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the sound ragged in the quiet room. The shadows in the corners seemed to shrink back, their malevolence dimming. Her silence, her simple, quiet presence was soothing the beast. It was starving the curse. He looked at her then, and the raw vulnerability in his gaze shattered her heart. The king was gone. In his place was a man, tormented and alone, reaching for a lifeline in a stormy sea. He lifted his free hand and gently cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. His touch was reverent, awe-filled. "Anya," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. It was the first time he had used it. The sound of it, spoken in his deep voice, resonated through her entire being. It was acclaiming, an acknowledgement. In that moment, the mate bond flared between them, no longer a gentle hum but a roaring inferno. It was undeniable, terrifying, and beautiful. He leaned in, his forehead coming to rest against hers. He closed his eyes, breathing her in. The world outside, the howling storm, the writhing shadows, it all faded away. There was only the two of them, a cursed king and a silent girl, finding a strange sanctuary in each other's brokenness. "This is madness," her rational mind screamed. "You are tying yourself to a man you can never truly have. You are courting disaster." But the wolf in her soul did not care for reason. It had found its mate. And for the first time in a decade, Anya allowed herself to feel a flicker of something she had long believed was dead: hope. The sanctuary they had found that night during the storm did not last. It was a fragile thing, a candle flame in a gale. In the days that followed, Rorik's behavior toward her changed. The watchful distance was replaced by an intense, possessive proximity. He no longer waited until evening to see her. He would summon her to the throne room, to the library, to the armory, simply to have her near while he conducted the business of his kingdom. She became his shadow, a silent presence at his side. The court noticed. The guards, the servants, and most of all, Morwenna noticed. The whispers followed her everywhere: the king's pet, the mute concubine, the witch who had ensnared him with her silence. Morwenna's hatred became a palpable thing. Her veiled insults turned into open hostility. She would contradict an unspoken preference of Anya's, countermanding an order for a certain type of tea or a specific book. Small rebellions designed to remind Anya of her place. Anya bore it all with the stoic endurance she had cultivated over a decade of silence. Her focus was on Rorik. She could see the effect her presence had on him. The curse seemed to loosen its grip. The shadows in his eyes retreated, and the lines of pain on his face softened. Her quiet companionship was a balm to his tormented soul, and the knowledge was both a comfort and a terror. The bond between them deepened with every shared silence, every fleeting touch, every intense, soul-searching gaze. The yearning inside her grew into a constant ache. She longed to speak to him, to tell him about the vow, to bridge the chasm that separated them. But she could not. The ghost of her mother stood between them, her memory demanding the sacrifice of her daughter's happiness. One night, the moon was full, a perfect silver disk in a cloudless, ink-black sky. It spilled its light over the stark courtyard of the keep, transforming the harsh black stone into soft, shimmering silver. Rorik led her there after their evening meal. He took her hand, his strong fingers wrapping around hers, and pulled her out into the cold, crisp air. The moonlight illuminated his face, softening the hard angles, making his stormy eyes gleam like polished silver. He led her to the center of the courtyard, to an ancient gnarled heart tree that stood as a solitary testament to life in this barren place. "My ancestors are buried beneath this tree," he said, his voice low and serious. "It is the heart of my kingdom, the heart of my line." He turned to face her, still holding her hand. His gaze was intense, burning with an emotion she had never seen in him before. It was raw, vulnerable, and utterly sincere. "Anya," he began, his voice tight with feeling, "I do not understand what you are. I do not understand this connection between us, but I know it is real. My soul, my very beast, recognizes you. It calls for you." Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew what was coming. She could see it in his eyes, feel it in the desperate grip of his hand. "You have brought a quiet to my soul that I have never known," he continued, his voice cracking with emotion. "You starve the curse. You are the balm to a wound I thought would be fatal. You are my mate. I feel it. I know it." He took her other hand, holding both of them in his powerful grasp. He looked into her eyes, and she saw a king laying his crown, his kingdom, his very soul at her feet. "Be my queen, Anya. Rule by my side. Let me claim you before my people, before the gods. Say you will be mine. Just one word. Say yes." The plea in his voice was a physical blow. Yes. The word was a scream in her mind, a desperate, frantic cry. "Yes, I will be yours. Yes, I am your mate. Yes, I love you." The feelings, so long suppressed, rose up in a tidal wave, threatening to drown her. Love. She loved this cursed, broken king. The realization was as terrifying as it was absolute. But the word could not pass her lips. The vow was a chain around her throat, strangling the life out of her. To speak now, to say yes, would be to break a sacred oath made on her mother's dying breath. It would be a betrayal of the highest order. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and thick. They spilled over, tracing silver paths down her cheeks in the moonlight. She shook her head, the movement frantic, desperate. She tried to convey everything with her eyes, the love, the agony, the impossible choice. But he did not see it. He saw only the rejection. His face, which had been so open and vulnerable, shuddered. The light in his eyes died, replaced by a storm of hurt and disbelief. His grip on her hands loosened, then fell away completely. He took a step back, the space between them suddenly a vast cold canyon. "No," he whispered, the word a broken thing. "You refuse me?" She reached for him, her hands trembling, wanting to pull him back, to explain the unexplainable. But he flinched away from her touch as if she had burned him. "I offer you a crown," he said, his voice losing its warmth, hardening back into the cold command she had first heard. "I offer you my name, my protection, my very soul. And your answer is silence. Your answer is no." He misunderstood. It was the great tragic misunderstanding she had feared since the moment she realized her feelings. He thought her silence was a choice born of contempt, not a prison born of devotion. "I see," he said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. It was more terrifying than his rage. "I mistook your condition for an affinity, a strength. I was wrong. It is a weapon, and you have just plunged it into my heart." Anya's own heart fractured. Each word was a hammer blow against its fragile surface. She was shaking her head again, tears streaming down her face, but it was useless. The damage was done. You will be returned to your tower, he said, his tone clipped and formal, the voice of a king addressing a disobedient subject. You will remain there. I will not be inconvenienced by your presence again. He turned his back on her. The finality of the gesture was absolute. He walked away, his broad shoulders stiff with pain and pride, leaving her alone in the cold moonlight, her silent screams trapped inside her. She sank to her knees on the cold stone, her body racked with sobs that made no sound. The heart tree stood over her, its ancient branches like skeletal fingers reaching for a cold and empty sky. She had done it. She had protected her vow. She had kept her promise to her mother. And in doing so, she had destroyed the only happiness she had ever known. She had rejected her mate, her king, her love. She had been cast out. And as she knelt there, weeping in the unforgiving silence, she had never felt more alone. The gilded cage had just become a true prison once more. The fall was as swift as it was brutal. One moment she was the king's shadow, the object of his intense fascination. The next, she was less than a ghost. She was nothing. The guards who came to her tower were not the king's personal shadow guard. They were common household sentries, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. They did not escort her from her opulent rooms. They hauled her. Her fine wool gowns were left behind. She was given a servant's rough-spun gray tunic, the coarse fabric scratching at her skin, a constant reminder of her new, lowly status. They did not return her to her tower. They threw her into a small, windowless cell in the servants' quarters in the deepest part of the keep. The room was cold, damp, and smelled of mildew and misery. A thin straw pallet served as a bed. This was her world now. The silence of her cell was different from the silence of the tower. Before, it had been a shared space, filled with unspoken emotion. Here, it was a suffocating, empty void, the silence of being forgotten. Days blurred into a monotonous gray. A silent servant would shove a bowl of thin gruel and a piece of stale bread through a slot in the door twice a day. It was sustenance, nothing more. No books, no fire, no view of the mountains. Just 4 stone walls and the crushing weight of her own despair. She did not see Rorik. The thought of him was a constant throbbing ache in her chest. She pictured him in his throne room, his face a mask of cold fury, the storm in his eyes raging once more. Had the curse grown stronger in her absence? Was he in pain? The worry for him was a torment far worse than her own physical discomfort. She had hurt him. She had pushed away the only person who had ever looked at her and seen something more than a broken, silent girl. Her only visitor was Morwenna. The king's cousin appeared at her cell door a week into her confinement. She was dressed in a gown of rich, dark velvet, a cruel smirk playing on her thin lips. She held a lantern, its light casting long, dancing shadows that made her look like a creature from a nightmare. "So the little mouse has found its hole," Morwenna sneered, her voice echoing in the small space. "I told you he would tire of you. He has a kingdom to run. He has no time for pathetic silent strays." Anya stared back at her, her expression carefully blank, refusing to give the woman the satisfaction of her tears. Morwenna's smirk widened. "He is suffering, you know. The curse has taken hold again, stronger than ever. The shadows in the keep are so thick you could choke on them. He sits on his throne and speaks to no one. He is consumed by his darkness." She leaned closer to the bars, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And it is all your fault." The words were poison-tipped darts, and they found their mark. Anya's composure cracked, a flicker of pain crossing her face. "Yes," Morwenna hissed, her eyes gleaming with triumph. You were a curiosity, a temporary balm. But your silence, it is not a cure. It is a poison of its own. Your unnatural quiet has angered the spirits of this place. It has fed the curse, not starved it. You are a witch, and you have brought a plague upon this house. It was a lie. Anya knew it was a lie. Her presence had soothed him. She was sure of it. But in her despair, a sliver of doubt took root. What if Morwenna was right? What if her unnatural, vow-bound silence was an affront to the ancient magic of this land? What if she truly had made everything worse? Morwenna saw the doubt in her eyes and pressed her advantage. The court is whispering. They say you cast a spell on him, a spell of silence and sorrow. They are calling for your head. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Anya's grief. This was more than just a rival's gloating. This was a calculated attack. Morwenna was not just enjoying her fall, she was orchestrating it. She was turning Anya's defining feature, her silence, into a crime. Soon, the king will have no choice but to listen to them, Morwenna said, her voice full of false sympathy. He will have to make an example of you to appease the court. A public example. She held Anya's gaze for a long moment, letting the threat sink in. Then she laughed, a short, ugly sound, and swept away, leaving Anya alone in the encroaching darkness, the seed of terror Morwenna had planted beginning to sprout. The next day, the guards came for her. They dragged her from her cell and up through the winding corridors of the keep. They took her to the great hall, where the throne sat upon its dais. The hall was filled with the sour-faced lords and ladies of the northern court. They stared at her as she was hauled in, their faces a mixture of fear, hatred, and morbid curiosity. They parted to let her through, as if afraid her presence might contaminate them. And on the throne sat Rorik. The sight of him stole the breath from her lungs. He looked like a king carved from stone and shadow. The life and warmth she had brought to him were gone, extinguished. His face was a pale, harsh mask of indifference, but his eyes were terrifying. The storm was back, a raging tempest of pain and fury, the gray almost entirely consumed by black. The curse was devouring him. Morwenna stood beside the throne, a hand resting proprietarily on its arm. She addressed the court, her voice ringing with false piety. "We have brought the witch before you," she declared. "This mute girl, who crept into our king's confidence with her silent sorcery. She has amplified the ancient curse upon this house. Her unnatural silence is a blight that has angered the gods and given the shadows a power they have not known in a generation." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled nobles. They were scared. The curse's growing strength was a threat to them all, and they needed a scapegoat. Anya was the perfect target. An outsider, a freak. Morwenna turned to the throne. "Your Majesty, the people are afraid. The very stones of this keep cry out against her. You must act. You must purge this poison from our midst." Rorik did not move. His gaze was fixed on Anya, but it was a vacant, distant gaze. He looked straight through her, as if she were already a ghost. Was he even listening? Or was he so lost in the pain of the curse, so lost in the pain of her rejection, that he was beyond reach? "Rorik," she cried out in her mind, "look at me. See me. This is a lie." "She must be put to death," Morwenna pronounced, her voice ringing with finality. "A public execution to show the people that their king will not tolerate witchcraft in his court. Let her blood cleanse the stain of her silence from these halls." A roar of approval went up from the court. "Death to the witch!" they cried. "Cleanse the keep!" Through it all, Rorik remained silent, his expression unchanging. He was a statue on a throne, a king in name only. It was clear that Morwenna was in control. She had used his heartbreak, his vulnerability, to seize power. She was manipulating his pain and the court's fear to get what she had always wanted: Anya gone, and her own influence over the king absolute. Finally, Rorik moved. He lifted a hand, a slow, heavy gesture. The hall fell silent. He looked at Morwenna, his eyes empty. "So be it," he said, his voice a dead, hollow rasp. It was the voice of a man who had already given up. At dawn, in the courtyard, the words were a death sentence. Her death sentence, signed by the man she loved. Anya felt the floor drop out from beneath her. This was not happening. He would not do this. The man who had touched her cheek with such gentleness, the man who had laid his soul at her feet in the moonlight, would not send her to her death. But the man on the throne was not that man. That man was gone, consumed by the shadows she had inadvertently helped to strengthen. As the guards grabbed her arms to drag her away to the dungeons, her eyes met Rorik's one last time. For a fleeting instant she saw a flicker of the man he had been, a flicker of agony, of regret, before the darkness swallowed it whole. He was a prisoner too. A prisoner of his curse, of his pain, and of Morwenna's lies. And she was going to die for it. The dungeon was colder and darker than her cell had been. It was a place deep in the foundations of the keep, where the chill of the mountain seeped through the stone, and the only sound was the dripping of water somewhere in the oppressive dark. They threw her onto the damp stone floor and barred the heavy iron door, leaving her in near total blackness. The finality of the sound echoed in her soul. This was the end. At dawn, she would be led out into the courtyard and executed. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her, crushing the air from her lungs. She had lost everything: her home, her freedom, her love, and now, her life. And for what? For a vow made in a child's grief, a promise to a ghost. Her mother's face swam in the darkness before her. The gentle smile, the kind eyes. "Would you want this for me?" Anya asked the memory. "Would you want my life to end this way, in silence and sorrow for a promise I made to you?" She thought of the stories she had read in the keep's library. Stories of sacrifice, of love, of vows made and broken. A vow was only as strong as its purpose. Her vow had been made out of love for her mother, to ensure her peace. But what if, in keeping it, she was causing so much more pain? She thought of Rorik, his tormented eyes, his soul being eaten alive by the curse. She had had the power to soothe him, to help him. Her silence had been a gift, a weapon against his darkness. But her inability to speak, to accept him, had pushed him away and allowed Morwenna's poison to take root. Her silence had become a liability. "My silence is a poison," Morwenna had said. What if the opposite were true? What if her voice was the antidote? An old legend she'd read came back to her, a fragmented tale about the Shadow King's curse. It spoke of a bond of true mates and a voice of pure heart, being the only things that could shatter the ancient sorcery. At the time, she had dismissed it as a fanciful tale, but now, could it be? Could her voice, the very thing she had sacrificed, be the key to saving him, to saving them both? The choice became terrifyingly clear: a vow made to the dead versus a life with the living. Her mother's peaceful passage versus Rorik's very soul. To break the vow is to condemn her spirit. The old fear whispered in her heart, but a new conviction rose to meet it. Her mother had been a woman of immense love and compassion. She would never have demanded a sacrifice that would lead to such destruction. She would want her daughter to live, to love, to fight. The vow had been a child's interpretation of a dying wish for peace. Perhaps the true peace would come not from keeping the vow, but from knowing when to let it go. The decision settled in her soul, heavy and resolute. She would speak, but not now. Not here in the dark, where no one could hear her. Her voice was her last weapon, and she would save it for the final battle. She would use it when it mattered most. A strange calm settled over her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, burning purpose. She would not die a silent victim. She would face her executioner. She would face her broken king, and she would unleash the one power she had left. The hours crawled by. Anya sat huddled in the darkness, gathering her strength, focusing her will. She thought of the first word she would say, Rorik's name. It would be her war cry, her prayer, and her declaration of love. Finally, she heard the scrape of the bar on her cell door. The first gray light of dawn was filtering through the cracks. It was time. The guards who came for her were grim-faced. They pulled her to her feet and bound her hands in front of her. They led her up from the dungeons, through the silent halls of the keep, and out into the central courtyard. A platform had been erected in front of the heart tree. A chopping block, ugly and stained, sat in its center. A tall, hooded figure stood beside it, his massive arms crossed over his chest. The executioner. The entire court was assembled, their faces pale and grim in the cold morning light. They watched her approach with a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. They were here to see a witch burn, to see the curse be cleansed. And on a balcony overlooking the courtyard, he stood. Rorik flanked by a triumphant Morwenna. He was dressed in stark black, a king of shadows presiding over her death. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone, but his hands, gripping the stone balustrade, were white-knuckled. He was not as numb as he appeared. He was fighting. He was suffering. Morwenna leaned close to him, whispering in his ear, her expression one of smug satisfaction. She was the one who had orchestrated this, the puppet master pulling the strings of a broken king. Anya's gaze locked on her, and for the first time she did not feel fear. She felt rage, a cold, clear rage for what this woman had done to the man she loved. The guards forced Anya to her knees before the block. The executioner moved to stand behind her, the shadow of his axe falling over her. This was it, the final moment. She lifted her head, her eyes finding Rorik's across the courtyard. She poured all of her love, all of her desperation, all of her unshed words into that final gaze. Look at me, please, see me. The executioner raised his axe. The crowd held its breath. The polished steel caught the first rays of the rising sun. Anya took a deep breath, drawing on 10 years of silence, 10 years of stored-up sound. She opened her mouth. R-O-R-I-C. The name tore from her throat not a scream, but a sound of pure, resonant power. It was a voice honed by a decade of disuse, clear as a bell and strong as a tempest. It shattered the morning quiet, a shock wave of sound that hit the courtyard like a physical blow. The crowd gasped. The executioner froze, his axe held high. On the balcony, Rorik staggered back as if he had been struck. His hands flew to his head, a look of agony on his face. But it was a different kind of agony. Not the pain of the curse, but the pain of something breaking. Morwenna shrieked, a high, piercing sound of fury and fear. She speaks! It is the witch's final curse. Kill her! Now! But no one was looking at Morwenna. All eyes were on the king. A black, smoky shadow poured from Rorik's body, a writhing, screeching mass of darkness. It was the curse, made manifest, torn from its host by the power of her voice, by the power of their bond. The shadow coalesced in the air before him, a terrifying, formless entity of pure malevolence. As the last of the shadow left him, Rorik fell to one knee, gasping for breath. He looked up, and his eyes met Anya's. The storm was gone. The darkness was gone. For the first time, she saw their true color, a clear, brilliant gray like the sky after a cleansing rain. He was free. "Anya," he breathed, his voice filled with awe and recognition. The shadow beast, now fully separated from its host, let out a piercing shriek and lunged, not at Rorik, but at Morwenna. "No!" she screamed. "I am your mistress! I fed you. I gave you his pain." In that moment, everyone understood. Morwenna had not just used the curse. She had been controlling it, nurturing it, using it to weaken Rorik and solidify her own power. She was the true witch. The shadow ignored her pleas. It enveloped her, her screams muffled as the darkness consumed her, and then, with a final, explosive shriek, the shadow itself dissipated into nothingness, taking Morwenna with it. In the stunned silence that followed, the executioner, recovering his senses, remembered his orders. He looked from the empty balcony to the girl kneeling before him. He tightened his grip on the axe. "The king's sentence must be," he began, his voice uncertain. Before he could finish, there was a blur of motion. Rorik, moving with a speed and power Anya had never seen, launched himself from the balcony. He landed in the courtyard with a ground-shaking thud and was in front of her in 2 strides. He grabbed the haft of the axe, stopping its descent inches from her neck. The wood groaned under his grip. He stared at the executioner, his eyes blazing with a righteous fury. "She is my queen!" he roared, his voice booming with a power and clarity that echoed through the keep. "Touch her again, and I will tear this castle down to its foundations with my bare hands." He wrenched the axe from the executioner's grasp and threw it aside, where it clattered harmlessly on the stones. Then he turned to her. He knelt before her, his expression a mixture of awe, relief, and profound regret. He reached out and, with trembling fingers, cupped her face. "You spoke," he whispered. "You saved me. I love you," she said, the words feeling new and strange and wonderful on her tongue. "I have always loved you." Tears streamed down his face, the first she had ever seen him shed. "And I love you, my mate, my savior." He leaned in and kissed her. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of promises made and a future reclaimed. In the middle of the courtyard, surrounded by his stunned court, the Shadow King claimed his silent queen, not with a crown or a proclamation, but with a kiss that healed them both. The silence of the Shadow Keep was broken, and in its place, a new era had begun. 1 year later, the Shadow Keep was a place transformed. The name no longer fit. Sunlight, once a timid visitor, now streamed through large glass windows that had replaced the narrow arrow slits. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the sounds of life. Music drifted from the great hall. The murmur of conversation echoed in the corridors, and children's laughter could be heard in the courtyards. The dark, forbidding stone had been covered with vibrant tapestries, and the scent of cold and shadow had been replaced by the aroma of baking bread and fresh flowers. It was now the Sunstone Keep, a beacon of hope in the north. Today, the sounds were of celebration. The king was officially taking his queen. Anya stood before a long mirror, her reflection a vision she scarcely recognized. She wore a gown not of dark wool, but of shimmering silver silk that seemed to capture the very light of the sun. Wild flowers were woven into her dark, flowing hair. Her face, once pale and haunted, was now filled with a quiet, radiant joy. The last year had been one of healing. For her, for Rorik, and for the kingdom. Breaking her vow had been the hardest and best thing she had ever done. It had not condemned her mother's spirit. Instead, it felt as if it had finally set them both free. Her voice, once her greatest sacrifice, was now her gift. She spoke often, her words weaving stories for the court's children, offering counsel to her husband, and singing softly to him in the quiet of their chambers. Rorik entered the room, and her breath caught, as it always did when she saw him. He was no longer the Shadow King. The darkness was gone, replaced by a strength and vitality that radiated from him. He smiled, a true, warm smile that reached his brilliant gray eyes. The sight of it still made her heart ache with love. "My queen," he said, his voice a low, loving rumble. "Are you ready?" She turned from the mirror and went to him, taking his offered hand. "I have been ready since the moment I first saw you," she answered, her voice clear and steady. He brought her hand to his lips, his gaze full of the same awe he'd had that day in the courtyard. "I was a fool. Lost in my own darkness, I almost destroyed the one thing that could save me." "We saved each other," she corrected softly, her fingers lacing through his. "Your wolf knew my soul, even when my mind was afraid." They walked out onto the balcony overlooking the central courtyard, the same balcony where he had stood to condemn her. Today it was filled with flowers, and the courtyard below was packed with all the people of their kingdom, nobles and commoners alike, cheering for their king and the queen who had saved him. They stood before the heart tree, its ancient branches now dotted with new green leaves, a sign of the land itself healing along with its king. Brennus, Rorik's loyal second-in-command, stood as witness, his helmet off for the first time, a broad, happy smile on his face. Rorik turned to her, taking both of her hands in his. "Before my people, and before the gods old and new," he proclaimed, his voice ringing with power and love, "I, Rorik, King of the North, claim you, Anya, as my mate, my wife, my queen. My heart is yours, my sword is yours, my life is yours. From this day until the end of all days." She looked into his eyes, her own heart overflowing. She saw her past, her present, and their future all reflected there. The auction block, the silent tower, the moonlit rejection, the terror of the dungeon, and the glorious, world-shattering power of a single word. It had all led to this, to him. "And I, Anya," she said, her voice filled with a strength she never knew she possessed, "claim you, Rorik, as my mate, my husband, my king. I give you my voice to fill your halls with song. I give you my heart to keep yours safe. I give you my life, to build our future together." He slid a simple, elegant silver ring onto her finger, and she did the same for him. As he leaned in to kiss her, the crowd erupted in a joyous roar. The kiss was not one of desperation this time, but one of profound peace and promise. It was the sealing of a bond that had been forged in silence, tested in darkness, and finally sanctified in the light. Later that night, as they stood on their balcony, watching the moon rise over their healed and happy kingdom, Rorik wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. "It is a good life," he murmured into her hair. "It is more than good," she whispered, leaning her head back against his shoulder. "It is a life I never dared to dream of." She was no longer the silent daughter, the broken toy, the witch in the tower. She was Anya, queen of the Sunstone Keep. She was a mate, a partner, and a savior. She had found her voice. She had found her love. And in saving him, She had finally, truly, saved herself. And their story, once a tale of shadow and silence, would now be a song that would echo through the ages.